Want to spend it doing that. So welcome everyone. I see a lot of the similar faces and names on here. I've seen some of the other Whenever, Wherever Wabash programs, which have been going exceptionally well. Tonight you're in for a treat. This is a good program and really good panel. These four did this, other than Dr. Peter Mikic did it, rather than Joyce Burnette, to cover economics. Did it to the Wabash community. It was very well received. I found it fascinating. I learned a ton. And so we wanted to recreate it for you, our alumni and friends. So thank you for joining. A couple things, stay muted if you can, please. If you have questions as we go along, please click the chat button at the bottom and just type it in there to everyone. Is fine, so people can see your questions. Then we will get those as we can afterwards. We have a 40 to 45 minute presentation style using PowerPoint that you can see on your screen now, followed by then Q&A, where we will go through the chat questions, but please use your chat on that. We have a big group, 66 right now and counting, it looks like. So that's why we want you to stay muted and ask questions through the chat. So we have four areas represented. Dr. Ethan Hollander will go first. Dr. Joyce Burnette, I should say Dr. Ethan Hollander from political science. Dr. Joyce Burnette will cover economics. Dr. Stephen Morillo will cover history. And then Amy Weir, director of our international programs, will attack the issue from that angle. So we're going to kick it off right now. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ethan Hollander to get it started.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ethan Hollander from the Political Science Department. This is the former Soviet Union, and the countries we're talking about, Ukraine and Russia, were both part of the Soviet Union until 1990, when they became independent countries. But of course, under the Soviet Union, it was really Russia in charge, as you might imagine. Russia was bigger than all the other republics combined. But of course, after the Cold War ended, after the Soviet Union dissolved, Ukraine and Russia become neighboring countries, sovereign countries. Ukraine is ethnically divided. It's a multinational country. Most of the people in Ukraine are Ukrainian. They consider themselves Ukrainian. They speak the Ukrainian language, and they feel a cultural connection or identity as Ukrainians. But about 17%, 18% of the country is made up of ethnic Russians. Maybe not surprisingly, they live in the east of the country for the most part, bordering on where Russia is. And these people are ethnically Russian. They speak Russian. They're citizens of Ukraine, but they might feel, at least some of them might feel, a closer connection to ethnic Russians across the border in Russia than they do to their fellow Ukrainian citizens. And this kind of ethnic divide is one of the key parts of this conflict. None of this mattered that much. Ukraine's position vis-a-vis Russia, or the Russian ethnic minority in Ukraine, none of that mattered very much when Ukraine and Belarus both were Russian puppet states. Viktor Yanukovych was basically a Putin stooge. There's Putin. And so, well, there's Putin, but they look remarkably similar. While Ukraine was a Russian puppet state, well, it didn't really matter too much to Putin if Ukraine, had other dalliances around the world. And it didn't matter much to the ethnic Russians in Ukraine if essentially their leader was Ukrainian, but a Russian stooge. That all changed, by the way. So here's sort of, I always tell my students that if they understand a political cartoon, they understand the issue that's behind it. And so Yanukovych and Lukashenko are Putin stooges, and I think these political cartoons illustrate that, right? So here's Lukashenko leaving his state visit to Russia. Here's Yanukovych at the time when he was basically being on life support from Vladimir Putin. So this started to change in a really important way in 2013, 2014, when there was a massive uprising in Ukraine against Yanukovych's government, in part motivated by Yanukovych's friendliness to Putin. A lot of the citizens in Ukraine didn't like that. And Yanukovych was then essentially overthrown in early 2014, February, I think, in the Maidan uprising. Well, this changed things, and it changed things in a number of ways. First of all, it changed things for Russia, because now NATO and the European Union were almost on Russia's doorstep. The Ukraine had for a long time kind of been flirting with NATO and flirting with the European Union and signing sort of preliminary deals that were sort of directed toward Ukraine one day joining the European Union or joining NATO. That wasn't so much of a worry to Putin when Yanukovych was in charge. Changed a lot when Yanukovych was overthrown and replaced by a very Western-friendly government. Now Russia had, potentially anyway, at least a much greater likelihood that NATO would be right on its doorstep. And given that Russia's sort of most effective defensive weapon for 2 centuries was its size, this was a really important thing, right? If Ukraine is a Western-friendly government, then the distance from the border of Ukraine to Moscow is much, much shorter than it would have been if foreign powers had to cross all the way through Ukraine to get to Moscow. So this made Russia worry. And I think there's a real way in which you can see this conflict going on in Ukraine as a conflict between sort of a Western view, the European Union and the United States, a democratic view, a liberal view, whatever you want to call it, and sort of a view that's more toward Russia. And in a way, you can almost see it as a continuation of the Cold War. If you ask most people in the West, most of us, I think, believe that this was a case of Putin provoking this conflict. And you look at that that political cartoon on the left, right? Putin seeing Ukraine drifting further toward Europe and provoking a conflict so as to prevent that. But it's worth saying that sometimes this is played in exactly the opposite way. And in Russia, it's played in the opposite way. They see this as a provocation by the United States and by the European Union, by NATO against Russia. And I should even say that this cartoon on the right is not a fringe source. That's from Foreign Affairs magazine. So a very, mainstream source, even in Western society, but not a view that you see very often. It's also worth saying that I think behind this conflict is a kind of debate within Ukraine over what kind of future it should have, right? Should Ukraine have a democratic future as a member of the European Union, a wealthy, industrialized democracy, essentially, hanging out with the popular cool kids, the rich popular cool kids, right? Or is it going to hang out with Vlad and his bad boys and their leather jackets smoking in the boys' room or whatever, right? This is the kind of conflict in a way that Ukraine is facing. And no, I didn't Photoshop that photograph from that's a still from Animal House. His hat really is yellow and blue, just by chance. But there you go. But if you've watched Rebel Without a Cause lately, you know that it doesn't end very well for either side. I'm not going to give any spoilers here, and I'm not going to make any predictions about the war in the Ukraine. But if you do see this as a conflict between the West and Russia playing out in Ukraine, it could very well end well, like that scene in Rebel Without a Cause. It's also worth saying that the sort of uprising then changed things, not just for Russia itself, but for ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Remember, those eastern portions of Ukraine are Russian majority regions. And the Russian majority in a democratic Ukraine would suddenly be a minority in Ukraine as a whole. It's one thing when Ukraine then is still a Russian puppet state, right? But I mean, democracy is associated with majority rule. And given that ethnic Ukrainians are the vast majority of people in Ukraine, a lot of ethnic Russians felt like they might become an oppressed minority at the hands of the Ukrainian majority now that Russia was no longer calling the shots. And that's why you hear Putin making claims of Nazis running Ukraine and of genocide in Ukraine. Right? These are wildly exaggerated claims of a Ukrainian government oppressing ethnic Russians. It is worth saying that it is harder to argue against him. I will say from the start, there's nothing justified about what Putin has done. But these are kind of the old-fashioned style of lie, where he's not just making something up out of thin air. He's finding little tiny kernels of truth and exaggerating the heck out of them. So within Ukraine, there is a radically nationalist neo-Nazi kind of battalion called the Azov Battalion. This was created in 2014 by ethnic Ukrainians that live in that Russian majority area to the east. And so it was, as they would say it, a defensive battalion for the Ukrainian minority in the Russian majority areas of the Russian minority in Ukraine. Right? So this was their defensive battalion, as they would say it. Russia, of course, labels them Nazi terrorists. And they do have a very radical right-wing, anti-Russian, anti-Semitic, you name it, kind of ideology behind them. It's also worth saying that the Ukrainian government did pass some laws that were at least controversial in terms of how they treated the Russian minority. There was a very controversial language law in 2019 that was sort of billed as a language law that sort of established Ukrainian as the official language, but it also put all kinds of restrictions on the use of Russian, which was an important language by this ethnic minority in Ukraine. Really important, sort of really kind of strict restrictions on the use of Russian in public schools, on the use of Russian on public television, a law that TV stations couldn't have more than a certain amount of their programming be in Russian, that sort of thing. So a lot of Russians saw this as a very oppressive law, and it is kind of hard to argue with that, but more on that later. In any case, this allowed Russia then to bill its invasion of Ukraine as a peacekeeping operation, right? Or as a humanitarian operation. They don't call it a war. They don't call it an invasion. They call it a humanitarian operation to protect the Russian-speaking minority in eastern Ukraine. Why does this matter? Well, Dr. Burnette is going to talk to you at length about this, but it's worth saying that a lot of Europe depends on Russian oil and Russian natural gas for its energy, and a lot of those pipelines run through Ukraine. It also means that Russia has a lot of leverage that it can use against the West in its threat to turn off those gas exports. It also matters because Belarus is kind of still in the balance, right? Belarus is still a Russian puppet, but there are a lot of people in Belarus who are flirting with closer relations with the West, closer relations with NATO and with the European Union. And as you can see by the looks of that bear in the cartoon, that makes a lot of Russians, and particularly Vladimir Putin, very nervous. It also matters because Ukraine isn't the only former Soviet state with a large Russian minority in it. As you see, Kazakhstan has nearly a quarter of its population being ethnically Russian, same as Estonia, more than a quarter in Latvia. And so if Putin is going to justify an invasion of Ukraine based on what happens when it becomes sincerely democratic, and then possibly then oppressive, right, with the majority population oppressing the Russian-speaking minority, you can imagine that he could replay that justification later on. So that's it. That's what I got. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Burnette. Oh, you got to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yes, the eternal Zoom problem. Thanks. I'm Joyce Burnette from the economics department, and my colleague Peter Mikek was in the original version of this, and he is in Slovenia right now, so I am filling in for him. So are you doing the slides, Ethan?
I'll do the slides, yeah.
Okay. So my theme is going to be the costs of the Ukrainian war, and the biggest slide. So you can go ahead and advance to go ahead and go to the next one. So the biggest costs are the human costs. We've had quite a number of deaths. The official count of Ukrainian civilians killed is surely an undercount. I'm sure there's more than that. There have been quite a few Russian troops lost, and that, of course, is it has to be one of the biggest costs of the war, is all the deaths. We also have quite a lot of refugees. So 5.8 million Ukrainians left the country, or more than 10% of the pre-war population, and 3.2 million of them are in Poland. So a large fraction of them ended up in Poland, somewhere elsewhere. I will say, I just heard that there's now a number of the refugees who are going back. But lots of human costs in terms of death and displacement. Next, I'm going to think about the economic costs to the combatants and the non-combatants. So first, in terms of the Ukraine. So Ukraine, obviously all the deaths of soldiers and civilians represents a loss of human capital, people that have skills that cannot be used in the future. There's been a tremendous toll in the loss of physical capital, buildings, transportation, that sort of thing. So the estimate I saw is $92 billion worth of damage to the infrastructure, most of which is residential buildings and roads. But of course, there's also factories and businesses, hospitals, schools, all the sorts of physical capital that the country needs to run its economy. And practically a disruption of production, right? Not only are people being diverted from their jobs to flee the country or fight the war, there's also just sort of on a basic scale, it's when there's war happening, it's hard to harvest the crops, it's hard to plant the crops. They're probably planted about a third less this spring than they would normally. Okay, so these are going to be long-term costs. Even if the war ends today, they would be looking at a tremendous bill for replacing their infrastructure and getting the economy back. Okay, so high cost to Ukraine. Next, we have the cost to Russia. So Russia obviously is the group who started this. So they're the country who started this. They have lots of costs. It's very expensive for them to wage the war. So there's the direct cost of the soldiers and the military hardware in Ukraine. I think there's a cost to the country in terms of a loss of liberty. So people who have protested against the war have been arrested, beaten, lost their jobs if they have any say anything against the war. And then, of course, the economy has suffered from really tremendous sanctions. I think the sanctions have been more than anybody expected before the war. There was a lot of speculation about, well, you know, people are really dependent on Russian oil and gas. They're not going to really reduce their consumption. I saw people thinking that they wouldn't, you know, it would just be too difficult to have the sanctions to exclude them from SWIFT. But in fact, we've had very, very substantial sanctions. So assets of the Russian central bank are frozen, can't be used for transactions. 7 banks and maybe 3 more are excluded from SWIFT, which is how banks exchange money. The US stopped importing oil and gas. We didn't import a lot though. Germany's probably the largest of the importers, and they are currently down about half of what they used to be, and expect to be phased out by the end of the year, importing Russian oil and gas. And many other, the EU decided not, I guess Hungary prevented them from saying no Russian oil and gas in general, but a lot of individual countries have stopped importing Russian oil and gas. And then many individual companies have stopped doing business with Russia, McDonald's, Starbucks, there's quite a long list. Okay, so these costs to Russia, I think, are not only current, but also long-term. Okay, so yeah, long-run cost of sanctions. So as countries move away from Russian exports, particularly oil and gas, they're going to find alternative sources for those things. It's going to accelerate our shift towards from fossil fuels to renewable resources, which is a good thing. And I think Russia's going to find that in the long run, even presumably someday, hopefully, this war will be over and we take the sanctions off. Even when that happens, their customers are going to be down. And the historical example I have from this is, so during the Civil War, there was an embargo and the South could not ship cotton to its main customer, which was England at the time. So during the Civil War, there's basically Britain could not get any cotton imports from the US. What they did then is they shifted towards other sources, such as Egyptian cotton. And even after the war ended and they were able to import from the US, they still continued using some of their other sources, and the demand from the US was down a bit. So I think the Russians are going to find that they're going to have some long-term loss of customers from the sanctions. All right. The second long-term cost that I have is the long-run cost of repression. And maybe this is more out on the limb, but so I just read an economic history paper arguing that Spanish GDP today is lower than it otherwise would have been because of the Inquisition. So the graph shows sort of the number of scientists living in Spain and other counter-Reformation countries. So that's the red line compared to other countries in Europe. So during this time, scientists decreased, and what had been a lead for Spain and those countries became a deficit in terms of number of scientists. And then this has had a consequence in terms of their GDP. So repressing ideas is not good for your long run growth. And so I think that's going to be a second long run cost for Russia. All right. And then the third thing to say, maybe a long run cost, is Russian debt. And there have been some sort of odd things happening with debt that I think are going to have some long run costs. Russia did get its sovereign debt down, so it's not particularly large, and they have the money to pay it. But if their bank accounts have been frozen, they can't use those bank accounts to pay the debt. And we've sort of been flip-flopping on whether they can use their frozen assets actually to pay off their bond payments. So a round of payments was allowed. April 4, the US says, no, you can't use blocked bank accounts to pay this off. Russia managed to find other sources to pay it, but it's going to be a problem for them to pay this. And if they end up defaulting on their debt, that could be a long run cost for them as well. All right, so now the last thing is economic costs to the rest of the world, which we have direct costs and trade costs as well. So of course, there's direct costs to sending all this ammunition to Ukraine. That is in fact making a big difference in the war. So US has approved $53 billion in sending armaments. There's a cost to the war in terms of supporting refugees. Poland is bearing a lot of that cost, but other countries as well. And then, of course, the rest of the world bears costs as a result of the disruptions and the sanctions. We have lost markets for our exports, and we have higher prices for the goods that we import from Russia and Ukraine. Okay, so I'll go through 3 examples. So the first example is oil and gas. And if we go to the next slide, we can see how important Russia is in terms of, so Russia is the second highest exporter of crude oil and the 4th highest exporter of gasoline. So they're a substantial exporter. And not only that, but they're also particularly for gas, it matters where they are. So Ethan showed the sort of all that gas going to Europe, and the next slide showed sort of, this is Peter's slide on where the pipelines are. And gas generally goes through a pipeline. It's very expensive to liquefy it and move it a different way. So the gas pipelines that supply all that gas to Germany and the rest of Europe generally go through the Ukraine. There was plans for one through the Baltic there that was abandoned as a result of the sanctions. So this is a big deal. And as a result, these countries have found it, Europe has found it kind of difficult to wean themselves off Russian oil and gas, although they were doing so. And there has been an increase in the price of oil. So the next slide is just the increase in the price of oil that you can see spiking up there around the time of the invasion. And this is a substantial reason why the gasoline at your prices that you are observing at the pump have gone up suddenly. Also, other things that are made with petroleum, such as fertilizer. And that's related to the next item that's important is wheat. Okay, so Ukraine in particular is important here as well as Russia. So you say Russia is the first, Ukraine's the 4th or the 5th largest. But in terms of exporting wheat, Ukraine and Russia together export 28.5% of all the world exports. Ukraine is more disrupted than Russia, but there's been a substantial disruption in the exports, the harvesting and exporting of wheat, leading to an increase in their price. So the next slide shows the increase in the price of wheat. And I will point out, this is a little bit of a deceptive graph. It doesn't have a bottom at 0, but the price of wheat spiked substantially, about 1/3 in March. So this is leading to the increases in the prices of any kinds of foods that use wheat. We can, of course, grow more wheat, but the problem with this is with the price of oil being higher, fertilizer is more expensive and is in short supply. So the places that can grow more wheat are finding it harder to do so because they lack the fertilizer that they need to grow more wheat. And then the last thing is maybe something you wouldn't have thought of, sunflower oil, but for this, Ukraine exports 39.2% of all sunflower oil in the world, and then Russia is the 2nd largest producer. Now, that's not the only kind of oil, but it is a substantial effect on the quantity of oil in the market. The price of sunflower oil has gone way up, and then this has also had knock-on effects of substitute oils. So other oils had already been going up because of things like drought. And so the price of things like palm oil and rapeseed oil, as well as sunflower oil, are also up. So one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine is that particularly poor countries find the price of their basic foodstuffs going up. Flour, cooking oil, these things have increased substantially, and that's a real hardship for particularly the poorest countries in the world. You know, we have to pay a little bit more for bread and maybe and gasoline, but we're not hurt as hard as maybe some of the countries who can't afford to pay those higher prices. And that's all I have for my section. So moving along to Stephen.
All right, hi folks. I don't have pretty pictures, so you got to look at my pretty face while I'm talking, and I'll try and keep this brief so you don't have to look at me for too long. When we did a version of this panel back in February, the war was only a week old, but it already looked to be going badly for Russia. And I suggested at the time that it would continue to do so. So on what basis did I make this sort of predictive analysis? Here's the fundamental principle. Authoritarian regimes, especially right-wing ones, which most are, create bad armies and wage war badly. Democracies, while not perfect, are a hell of a lot better at making and using armed forces practically and morally. And I can imagine some of you are saying, wait, what? So let me run through some of the evidence for this. First, the apparent counterexamples can be deconstructed. You know, you think an authoritarian regime with a bad army. Wait, what about Nazi Germany? Well, the Wehrmacht of Blitzkrieg fame was a German army grounded in 2 centuries of Prussian militarism, which was led by this small, coherent group of Prussian aristocrats, which was expert at tactics and operational warfare ever since Frederick the Great, with a damn good thrashing at the hands of Napoleon and revolutionary France thrown in to learn from. That army got steadily worse as the war went on, the more Nazified it became. And the Wehrmacht, in any case, and Hitler, were terrible at strategy. And they never matched their image. 90% of the German army in 1939 was horse-drawn. The motorized Blitzkrieg army was a 10% low motorized spearhead to the army. Its tanks in Russia, when it invaded Russia, often outran its horse-drawn fuel supplies. Well, what about the Soviet army, the Russian army in World War II? Well, the Red Army first barely escaped entering the war, having been utterly torn down by Stalin's purges. They managed to stop that and rebuild the army just in time. It was rebuilt along lines established before Stalin that were part of a pan-European discussion of the lessons of World War I, and it was therefore fairly broadly informed. And the Red Army did indeed get steadily better during the war as a matter of survival. But their strengths were, one, as Ethan sort of pointed out, geographic space, which is only useful in defense, not when they go on the attack, and manpower, of which they were vastly wasteful, with a hugely disproportionate number of casualties taken by Ukrainians, not ethnic Russians. And Russia today is a demographic sinkhole. They are running out of troops already. And finally, this is a Russia whose the Red Army in World War II was increasingly ran on American trucks and Lend-Lease equipment. The problem of manufacturing and technical expertise was not entirely solved by them. We can turn also to support this principle to the historical record of the last 2 centuries. For example, by the way, it's the last 2 centuries because before 2 centuries ago, it's all authoritarian regimes. That's what monarchies are. So that factor sort of cancels out, except perhaps in Athens versus Sparta. And some of what I'm saying simply echoes Pericles' funeral oration. But the Napoleonic Wars show the early beginning of this. The Crimean War, you had Britain and France, Western emerging democratic powers beating Russia. The American Civil War, the Union, which was a democratic society, beat the authoritarian Confederacy. In World War I, the democracies won. In World War II, the democracies won. Another example would be the Arab-Israeli wars, and more recently, and I'll come back to that example. So why? How does this principle work? Well, it works at every level of military analysis. Politically, which means a sort of level of grand strategy. democracies committed to a war support it more fully and openly than an authoritarian government can. And you say, whoa, autocrats are immune from political disapproval. But in fact, they must tend to public opinion more pervasively and carefully because they're in fact more fragile, especially in the face of defeat, than a democracy is. Institutionally, democracies are better at the hardest job any army has, which is critical self-evaluation and accountability. Autocracies simply don't do that very well. Democracies don't always do it well, but they do it better than autocracies. And this is because you get a diversity of views, debates over grand strategy, debates over force construction, debates over strategy, et cetera, which lead to better, more carefully considered outcomes. In short, many heads are better than one. And thus, democracies are better at intelligence and self-evaluation. People don't tell the autocrat what he doesn't want to hear, and therefore, it's hard to correct course. In addition, autocracies are more corrupt from these same factors. Russia's modernized military in this war exists mostly in the fleet of oligarchs' yachts currently being seized around the world. When we buy an $800 toilet seat, at least we get an overpriced toilet seat. The autocrat gets the pile of crap that went through it. Plus, the autocracies are hierarchical in politically comprehensible but militarily counterproductive ways. That is, they tend to aim at elite units. And we see that at play right now in the disaster of Russian radio communications in the war, where their elite units have these highly sophisticated radio sets that are encrypted and immune from spying. But in order to communicate with the rest of their own army, with the non-elite units, they have to go to open channel stuff. And the West just sort of listens in and said, oh, here's a Russian leader to kill. Moving down a level strategically, democracy's goals are more likely to be largely in line with their own national interests and not the result of one man's paranoid fantasies. This is the paranoid bully model of making strategy. And we can note here Putin's use of the word fascist. I would recommend reading Tim Snyder on this. The Soviet use of the word fascist was very vague, basically meant our enemies. And Putin has continued with that usage where fascist for Putin basically means enemies to the West. It does not have any kind of ideological definition to it. And the ideology behind that is toxic nationalism run amok. And finally, the fact that democracies don't fight each other, which is a sort of political science rule, continues to apply for this very reason. That is the strategic goals being more in line with popular national interests, which aids alliance building. Even operationally and tactically, that is, and you get to the nitty-gritty in warfare. The reason the German army before the Nazis was so good at that level, tactically and operationally, is that they were able to trust their commanders to carry out missions in accord with the sort of general ethos and plans of what they were doing. This is what the Germans called Auftragstaktik, or in English is known as mission orders. You tell a commander what he's supposed to accomplish, and he figures out on the ground how to accomplish it. Democracies can generate self-reliant local commanders who can do this. Autocracies don't want anyone other than the leader to have information or decision-making capability. Democracies can do this because democratic populations are better educated and used to running things themselves. We see the results of this in the current war, most recently in the Russian fiasco of trying to cross the Donets River, where they were ordered to cross by the Central Command. They started to cross. because of the information problems, Ukrainian artillery was able to destroy the makeshift bridge they built. Rather than moving somewhere else, they built 2 more bridges in the exact same spot. The Ukrainian artillery didn't even have to recalibrate its firing, and they just took all 3 bridges out. The Russians lost 82 vehicles of various kinds, several thousand soldiers. This is because centralized command structures are slow and badly informed and slow to react and more subject to fatal decapitation. See the deaths of Russian commanders again. All of this basic principle accounts for the results we've continued to see since that first week of the war. Russian incompetence, equipment failures, logistical disasters, and troop unrest. When on the 3rd attempt to cross the Donets, they were apparently sort of threatening their soldiers with jail time back home if they didn't do this suicide mission again because Central Command had ordered it. We also see on the other side, Ukrainian local initiatives, commitment, and ability to deploy the high-tech equipment they've been sent. And we've seen a revival of the democratic world's solidarity in the face of Russian aggression. This is the alliance building, the common interests. All of this resulting in Russia's autocratic resort to increasingly brutal attacks on civilians and threats of escalation to try and make reality conform to the autocrat's illusionary view of the world. Now, what is the lesson for us right now of this principle and the Ukraine-Russian war? It's very simple. Don't fucking support autocrats. And this includes Donald goddamn Trump and his fascist GOP toadies who have yet to meet a right-wing autocrat they don't love. Orban, Erdogan, above all Putin, because he's the image of a strong white man who will fight for traditional values. The reality is that he's a racist, indeed white supremacist, theocratic Christian, family values defending murderer whose army and country are in fact weak. But the GOP makes us potentially the weak link in the democratic chain holding back autocracy, because we've got a major party that is openly anti-democracy and who, along with their lying propaganda machine at Fox News, viz. Tuckio Rose Carlson, they want the Russians to win. See, for instance, most recently, Rand Paul holding up the aid bill for a whole week because that'll really own the libs, right? So, and therefore my conclusion is vote against Republicans at every level in every election you can vote in, because democracy, diversity, and discussion wins wars, while the Bapto-fascists who are banning books and people are setting you up to lose your next war badly and perhaps fatally for the American Republic. Thank you.
So I guess we go next to Amy Weir. Amy, would you like me to share my screen again so we can get back to your PowerPoints?
Yes, please. Thanks,
There you
Ethan. Well, good evening, everybody. As Ethan mentioned, my name is Amy Weir. I'm the Director of International Programs at Wabash. By way of background, there are roughly 355,000 people who were born in the Ukraine who currently live in the US. And my boyfriend, Michael, is one of them. So I have a personal interest, and I think that's partially why I was invited to be here today, because I'm not an expert on Ukraine or Russia, but I've been doing some research, trying to follow the news. And I'm especially interested in what each side is saying and thinking. And I want to mention from the outset, these are generalizations, right? When you have two sides, often you have to speak in generalizations. So please bear with me. Next slide, please, Ethan. I like to start with Russification. that's because I do think that that's part of where some of this conflict comes from. Russification is a form of cultural assimilation that has its roots in the 17th century when the Russian czars attempted to exert more control and tried to stretch and extend their empire. Non-Russians, of course, who are part of that empire had to give up their culture, had to give up their language in favor of taking on the Russian culture and Russian language. Russification intensified in the early 18th century when the Ukrainian language was entirely banned from the Orthodox Church. Then in 1876, Tsar Alexander II prohibited the printing of texts in Ukrainian and also the publishing of books in Ukrainian abroad, making it so that Ukrainians couldn't get their hands on any sort of publication in their own language. Children as that were part of the empire, as young as nursery school and kindergarten, were compelled to use only Russian in school, including recess, which I'm like, wow. Even during recess, you can't speak your own language. And so due to these bans of the Ukrainian language, all scholarship in science was totally absent in the Ukrainian language. And then in the 1930s, Stalin waged a war against Ukrainian culture. For instance, Ukraine went from having 260 active writers to just 36 in a period of only 8 years. Writers went missing, writers were executed in public, and writers were imprisoned. And so the only writers remaining were the ones who spoke the truth of the folks in charge, essentially. Next slide, please. I'm going to spend a little bit more time tonight talking about what the Russians are thinking, as I think the US media has been doing a better job of explaining what's happening in Ukraine, essentially, right? And recently, I read a very lengthy article, I think it was around 50 pages, where a Russian journalist named Shura Burton spent several weeks talking to Russian citizens about their thoughts and feelings about the war, likely at great risk to himself. So here's what Mr. Burton found. He found that Russians recited the propaganda from state television essentially verbatim. They would say that they're against war in general, but they were in favor of this war. They'd say things like, we're liberating them, and we're not fighting civilians. Also, the Russians Mr. Burton interviewed said that Ukrainians are being brainwashed. And several Russians, I thought this was interesting, several Russians mentioned that a mystic named Baba Vanga predicted that Russia would be a global superpower by 2026. And this implies that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is somehow predetermined, right? It's mythical or something like that, bringing Russia back to its status as a superpower. Many of the Russians that Mr. Burton talked to didn't suspect that their ideas about the war might not correspond to the reality. And others would mention that the brotherhood existing between Russian speakers fell with the fall of the Soviet Union, creating an us versus them scenario. Some of the Russians would say Ukrainians hate us, which is actually something that started in 2014, right, with the annexing of Crimea. And the Ukrainians are leaving us behind. Let's see. when Mr. Burton, as Mr. Burton was talking to non-Russians in other contexts, people would ask him, do Russians not know what's going on? And Mr. Burton answered, no, honestly, most of them don't. But living in Russia, they understand, right? They're on some level, there's an understanding, having this experience with the Putin regime, they understand what's probably going on, even if their media doesn't show this to them. Ethan, I'd like to see the next slide, please. As many of you have probably already seen in the news, this invasion has caused millions of Ukrainians to seek refuge in neighboring countries. Right now, as Dr. Burnette pointed out, it's around 6 million refugees, but not everybody was able to get to a friendly country, shall we say. And up to 1 million people were deported to these so-called filtration camps. And that's what you're seeing here in this photograph. It's what you do on your way to resettlement in Russia. What people who've experienced this have reported is that their families were broken up, but usually by gender, the males and the females were broken up. Sound familiar? Cell phones are searched, that there is fingerprinting, and bodies are searched for tattoos, especially on the men. 5 to 10% of the men who are going through these filtration camps don't pass. They don't pass the examination and aren't seen again. But I don't know what that means at this point, right? Next slide, please, Ethan. And so now I'll go a little briefly into what do the Ukrainians think? And again, you've probably seen a lot of this in the media. Many Ukrainians will say that the war didn't start in 2022, but it actually started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea by Russian. And so this is not a new war. We've been doing this for 8 years. Many Ukrainians are not Russian sympathizers, including my boyfriend, Michael. He speaks Russian. He can understand Ukrainian, but he speaks Russian. And he wants to see, and as many do, a separate democratic Ukraine, a Ukraine that ultimately will become part of the European Union, hopefully. Ukrainians also know that they're outgunned, but they're, as Stephen so well put it, many are willing to fight, and they have the tools to be more effective even than a larger army. Most Ukrainians want to see the end of corruption in their own government. And that was indicated by the election of President Vladimir Zelensky. Probably many of you know that prior to his role in the government, he starred in a sitcom about a school teacher who ranted about corruption, was filmed during this rant, and then was voted into the presidency. You can stream that first season of Servant of the People on Netflix. I would encourage it. I know Michael really enjoyed it. And then finally, I want to mention that most Ukrainians want the people of Ukraine to have a voice in their government. Next slide, please. And so this leads us to Maidan. And this is a square that Dr. Hollander had mentioned too. See the statue here. The Maidan Square is the Independence Square in Kyiv. It's known throughout Europe as a place where Ukrainians can go for political expression. The Maidan has hosted 3 rounds of mass protests in 1990, just right before independence, 2004 to 2005 with the Orange Revolution, and then, as Ethan mentioned, in 13 and 14. That was the most recent. So we'll go to next slides. They're political cartoons. And this, I think this helps to reflect a lot of Ukrainians' opinions. It's, you know, of course, like I said, it doesn't represent everyone. But you've got your tractor with the Ukrainian flag pulling away the ineffective tank. And next we have Putin in his big Titanic being brought down by the hidden iceberg that is the Ukrainian people. And then finally, though this one appears to be in France, sorry, the Ukrainian girl with flowers in her hair stomping on the tanks. But I think that does represent how many of the Ukrainians that I know seem to feel about the situation. And then I do want to make, and Ethan, you can go ahead to the resources if you want to, so people can look at it. I do want to make a few final notes. There could be many more casualties of this war, of course, on both sides. As others have mentioned, an already weakened Ukrainian economy could become even weaker, even with Western help. And a lot of the information I got about how Russians are thinking came from a local member of our community, Ms. Annie Fisher. She is a fluent speaker of Russian and a professional translator, and she turned me on to the work by Shura Burton. Again, I think he probably took great risks to ask Russians what they were thinking about this. And he said many of the respondents wouldn't even, well, not respondents, many of the people he approached wouldn't even acknowledge him because they were perhaps afraid. Also, I do want to point out that there are many Russians who do not want this war, and they don't support the war either. And they are demonstrating even under threat of arrest, detainment, and maybe even beatings. And probably some of you have seen in the news too, sources estimate that between 200,000 and 1 million Russians have fled their homeland as well since the war began. So I do have a couple of resources for you. I don't know if these slides will go out later, but Bellingcat is an online resource. I think it is Dutch, but it's sort of a fact verifying kind of site. I also learned a lot about Russia because I didn't know a ton, I have to admit, by reading Bill Browder. He's got a couple of books out. And then this third article here, Feeling Around for Something Human by Shura Burton, that's the one. It's worth a read if you really want to see what's going on with Russians. And Ethan, can we go one more? And then these are the other things that the other resources that I went to. And then finally, I just have a thank you to Annie Fisher for all of her help in this, and Michael, because he helps with his guidance every day.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Steve Hoffman, who's our basic MC for the evening anyway. Steve, I'm going to stop the screen share.
Yeah, I have actually, there are a couple questions. I'm going to combine two about the war for Dr. Morillo. There are two questions back to back. One is, how do you see the war ending? And then the other one is, what escalation do you see in this war?
Yeah, great questions. My standard answer to the first sort of question is, I'm an historian. I deal with the past. I don't predict the future. But I understand that's a cop-out. How do I see this war ending? I think the strongest parallels, suggestive parallels, are in fact with Tsarist Russia in World War I. The war has a serious potential of ending in mutiny in the Russian army, uprising against the Putin administration, especially if, as it seems it's leaning towards, it has to start implementing conscription. That'll sort of explode the cover that this is just a minor military sort of police operation. You don't conscript for that. the possibilities for escalation, those are scarier and are really much less predictable. It's possible that if things do start getting particularly bad for the Putin regime, that his response has something to do with the nuclear button. I suspect the person best to answer that would be my former student, Dave Stone, who's in the audience here and who's an expert on Soviet military history.
Was that asking for a comment from David Stone?
It was suggesting a comment from Dave
Okay.
Stone. If he's there, Dave, do you want to say something about that?
Okay.
Or-
Yeah, I don't know if he's still on. I know he was on earlier. Then there was one more said, not really a question, but it asked for someone to address prior Russian aggression in Georgia.
So I can say that I haven't prepared on that, but it's a similar story in Russia. Excuse me, in Georgia. Russia did invade and occupy a region of the the former Soviet state of Georgia, a region in the north of that area called South Ossetia, which is populated by ethnic Russians. Same sort of situation, right? The Russian government claiming that Russian minority in Georgia was being oppressed or was at risk of being oppressed, and coming in to defend them. In fact, that was I forget the exact timeline of everything, but one of the earlier little dust ups in this conflict before things really got hot in the Ukraine conflict was with that. So Russia invaded South Ossetia, which is in North Georgia, and that sort of prompted Ukraine to renew some negotiations with NATO and with the EU, unsurprisingly, and that sort of thing. So I think I could look more into it and suggest you all do too. But I would suspect you'd see a similar dynamic in Georgia as you see in Ukraine. It might not have gotten this hot yet, but the same sort of thing of an ethnic majority in that country, in a country that's actually becoming sincerely democratic. Democracy is associated with majority rule, which means at least the potential for the Russian ethnic minority to be persecuted. Never persecuted to the extent that Putin will say, but to be honest, probably more so than we're used to reading in the Western press. Anyway, and it goes from there.
Thank you. One last question. This is the last question, and it's Wabash centric. I like it. Has Wabash brought students back from Europe because of the war? How has it affected us?
That's for Amy,
might be
I
best
think.
That's an Amy
for
question,
you.
right?
Yeah, that's-
Yep.
We didn't bring anyone back from Europe this semester. We did have a student in Russia. And so he's a well-known student. And so his program saw this coming, right? And well, saw the needing to cancel the program and figure something else out. So they moved everyone in Russia from the program to Kyrgyzstan. So he's been in Kyrgyzstan, but after spending a couple of weeks in Russia and getting to have a little taste of the sanctions, right? I think he was happy to be able to access his money, but I think it was very interesting for him, and I can't wait to hear more when he comes back.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, actually, can I add something? He not only he's going to stay in Europe through the summer, he's going to take Russian in Riga, Latvia, which I don't know if a lot of you have been to Riga, but there's a heck of a lot of Russian spoke there. Michael heard Russian wherever we went in Riga. So I think it'll be really good for the student to see how and where he'll be able to speak Russian. Yeah, it'll be a good experience, a good global education for him.
Yeah, what an experience. Wow. Ethan's jumping in. He would like to answer the question about the Maiden Revolution.
So yeah, I saw that there was the very
There
first
was.
question that was asked by Cynthia Bell. Didn't the U.S. have a hand in the Maidan uprising? Remember, that was the uprising that in a way started this most recent chapter in all this. It was the uprising that resulted in the overthrow of Yanukovych. President Obama at the time claimed, very loud proclamations that the U.S. position was for the people of Ukraine to decide for themselves who their government would be. But the United States was certainly rooting for the uprising. And not surprisingly, right, it was a pro-democratic uprising against a Russian puppet. But it's hard to know how official that was. I don't know, first of all, how official that was. And I would imagine we didn't come out and make loud statements about sponsoring the uprising. It's worth saying that in Russia, that's played out as a coup. In the Russian press, in the Russian narrative, the Maidan uprising was a Western-sponsored coup against Yanukovych, a democratically elected official. And that just sort of goes to show too that that's the Russian perspective. I have made a point of reading up on that too. I actually downloaded RT before the war because I saw this coming and I knew I wanted to be able to read it. And now it's impossible to download RT because it's part of the sanctions, right? But since I've already got the app, I can read it. You can get to it through like the internet, but you can't download the app, which means that, I don't know, maybe Putin is watching this. But there you go.
All right.
But long story short, nobody really knows the extent of US involvement in the Maidan uprising. But it's hard to know that kind of thing. We were certainly rooting for the people who overthrew Yanukovych, but it's hard to tell.
Great, thank you very much. With that, everybody, we're going to end it. So how about a big virtual applause for our 4 panelists? Thank you all very much. Oh, not so virtual applause from Scott Dreyer. I appreciate it. I guess it's still virtual. Hey, thanks everybody for joining. You'll be getting a survey from us if you don't mind filling it out for this event. We would appreciate it. Thank you again, panelists. Fascinating. Thank you all for joining. Keep an eye on future, wherever Wabash events at wabash.edu/www.